Hello, everybody. This is Steve, also known as Born Again RN. Hope everybody is having a decent evening in this hot weather if you are living in any part of the country. It's roughly around 90 degrees in here, so I'm very happy about being in an air conditioning room. So hope everybody is staying cool and safe out there. Tonight, I have a very special guest. I'm very honored to have this gentleman by the name of Jonathan Sheffield. And before I bring him out, I want to just give a little background about him. For the last 6 years, Jonathan has created a new genre in Christian apologetics by putting them in 2D and 3D animations. It's really cool. You need to check out his YouTube channel, where he's defending how we got the text of the New Testament and the historicity of the Bible, which is part of the topic of our discussion tonight. Jonathan is a High Church Anglican. We're going to touch on that a little bit as well. Representing and defending his historical positions and polity or church government. Jonathan has formally debated and defended his thesis against the likes of Dr. Bart Ehrman, Dr. Richard Carrier, Dr. Mark Goodacre, Dr. Matthew Monger, Matt Dillahunty, Dr. Josh Bowen, and most recently, Trent Horn from Catholic Answers on the Old Testament canon, which we'll be discussing tonight. Who Trent has affectionately said that he is a scholar. And when you talk with him and looking at his research, you can attest that he is a scholar. He knows what he's talking about, as well as other academic scholars in the field of expertise. So without further ado, I am proud to bring Jonathan out. Hi, Jonathan.
Well, hello, Steve. Thanks for having me on your channel this evening.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine. I'm glad that when we got together and we talked about coming on the channel, I was very honored the fact that you would come on my tiny small channel to have a discussion about something that we share about, talking about the Old Testament canon, which some people would say, hey, what's the big deal about talking about the Old Testament? And we're going to get into that because it's more important than people realize. But before we actually do that, I thought that you maybe talk a little bit about yourself, maybe how you got into apologetics. Did you have a Christian upbringing, background, a little bit about yourself, and a little bit about your ministry?
Okay, well, thank you. Well, I'm originally from Brooklyn, New York, residing now down here in San Antonio. It's been 105, 106 degrees the last several days, so we would love to have 90 degrees down here. But
Mhm.
I grew up in the Anglican Communion, so I am a cradle Episcopalian. So I was born into it very, very early. Raised, throughout in the Episcopal Church. So I do come, from an upbringing in a Christian household. I always enjoyed going with my dad to church, Bible studies, and I got really interested in the history of the church and apologetics early on. And I think for the apologetic ministry, I've been studying for a number of years, probably going on probably about 20 years. And, when my mom passed away and we moved my dad in, I thought this would be, a really great opportunity, to keep my dad focused, who'd been married to my mom for, over 41 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So, you know, uh, great family. They were together 41 years. But when she died, I wanted him to, have a reason to keep on going. And, I thought this ministry that we had talked about, would be something that not only continue in his spiritual growth, but mine as well, and something we can do together. So what started out as building cartoon animations, and part of it is my influence from C.S. Lewis, who I thought always did a really great job of taking theological concepts and breaking them down into digestible information with his Narnia series. So I thought, hey, if we're going to go out here and really break down some of these issues, let's do it in animations. So that was the concept of our ministry. And before long, they started catching notice. I started getting some requests to have some discussions, and before you know it, I'm sitting down across the other aisle with scholars like Dr. Bart Ehrman and Dr. Richard Carrier to defend our thesis for the Christian worldview.
Oh yeah, I mean, and you just named some big names there as well. So very, very impressive, and like I said, you just recently debated Trent Horn on the Old Testament canon, which is what we're going to be talking about tonight. And he's said on more than one occasion that he looks at you as being a scholar. And listened to your debate, and I would listen to your other debate that you had. Did you have one against who is it? Singenis, Robert Singenis, or who
Uh,
was
um,
there was somebody else you had a debate with recently. I can't remember who it was, but I mean, I listened to you, and it was like this guy knows what he's talking about. I mean, you can really tell when you're talking that you have all this knowledge, almost like you have all this knowledge in your head, and you're trying to get it. You can't get all of it out, obviously, especially in time debates.
Yeah, no, there's sort of a little tunnel vision effect that you're trying to get over your points. I've been going to more visualizations in my
Hmm.
presentation to at least help the audience digest at least the points that I'm trying to get over. So it's been some very fruitful discussions I've had, not only with the Trent Horn discussion, but really presenting our case to the secular world.
Right. There's a few people in the chats, and some are already asking questions. And I'm just going to say that if you have any questions, kind of leave them towards the end. I'm going to try to star them and hold them over to the side. Don't know how long this is going to go, but maybe when we hit like the 1 hour mark, we'll see like where we're at this point, and see if we want to kind of cut to Q&A, depending on how many questions there are and how many people are in the live chat. So all right, let's get going. You recently had a debate, as I mentioned, against Trent Horn on the Old Testament canon, something that I can resemble that remark, because I also had a debate against Trent Horn about a year and a half ago. Very super nice guy. I mean, even though this is an area that you and I would disagree with him on about the Old Testament canon, I found Trent to be very polite, very intelligent, very well prepared. So he's somebody that I really enjoy debating, because he really sticks to attacking the argument rather than attacking the individual, because sometimes debates can get heated, and he really keeps his cool. So I have to give him credit for that, and to you as well. So I thought it was a very professional debate that you guys had. So
Oh no, thank you, Steve, and likewise, I got the opportunity in preparing for this discussion with Trent Horn to go over your information. And I thought you made a very solid case against his arguments. It was very professional. I found Trent in my engagements in some of the presentations I watched. He's an academic. He's an intellectual.
mhm.
Even in some of his arguments against the atheists, I found like he's done a really good job, and I thought our discussion, given our backgrounds, would make for a fruitful discussion on here, despite our differences on this issue.
Right, right. Well, as I was watching the debate and even reflecting on my own with Trent and with Gary Michuta beforehand, that was actually the first debate that I had did on the canon. I noticed that aside from disagreeing which canon was the canon of Jesus in the first century, because obviously Jesus knew what the canon was, and obviously he's God, so he knows which books are scripture and which aren't. And then the question goes on: did he pass it along to his disciples, who then passed along to the early church down to the present age? But there's a second point that pops up in the debate, and it's a matter of whether or not there was a set Jewish canon in the first century. And when you talk with the Protestants, such as yourself or myself, we would say yes, there was a set Jewish canon. That doesn't necessarily mean that every individual Jew believed, agreed to this canon, just like there are individual Catholics during the Reformation and around the Council of Trent that agree to every single book in their canon. But with Catholics, they'll say, no, there's all this mix of different canons. The Sadducees had one set, the Pharisees had another set, Essenes had another set, assuming they were the ones that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, which I think you brought up during the debate, which was very good. Did you want to maybe start on that, touch on that?
Yeah, I think it was important, at least when I was presenting the information, to go directly to the foundation. I sort of began with Romans 3:1 through 2 because it sets a starting point for this conversation. Where do we begin this investigation, understanding, what is and what isn't the canon? So, given that we have this biblical injunction, it gives us a starting point to look to. And, I think when we look at the empirical observation now, Josephus very early on, writing at the end of the first century, is speaking that the Orthodox Jewish community as a whole, and he doesn't really make a distinction between various groups that didn't support different scriptures. He says this is their canonical tradition that has come down. He defines it within a three-part series. He also, gives evidence to support the canon that we understand today was not only closed at the time of R.C. Xerxes, but the Jewish communities throughout the Mediterranean world, had this common identification where they adhered, and this is the canon that they witnessed to. And I think when we look at these different groups, and even though we can make different assumptions, um, I think this is what we see throughout the Jewish community. And I think some of the distinction that is not being made by Trent and others is there was this distinction between external works that is part of their Jewish liturgy, other works of history that are, while they're well received within their communities, there was a distinction between what was considered in the ark per se, or their oracles of God, and those that, while they had you know good historical information and in many ways were part of their Jewish communities and their liturgy, are not part of the canon. And how else do we explain the fact except they were never a part of it? And what the Jewish community has handled down is what we witness to in our Protestant confessions.
Right. One of the arguments that you started out with, and it's one that I've used and other Protestants have used that isn't convincing to a lot of Roman Catholics, is the Romans 3:2, the oracles of God argument. And what I thought I would just kind of put this up here. It's kind of in short form, but where it says that the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. The oracles referring to the Old Testament scriptures. Now, during the debate, Trent had made the comment that the word oracles, isn't necessarily limited to the books. It simply means revelation. But based on the actual word, the root word is logos, which is, where we get the word from. And it literally means Old Testament prophecy given by the prophets. And I think you mentioned about Philo of Alexandria. At one point, he actually uses the term oracles to refer to this, and he's a contemporary with Jesus and the Apostle Paul, who's writing about this. And I did a little digging, and actually I cover this in my book, Why Protestant Bibles Are Smaller, that the word oracle is a synonym for the word. If you notice, it's the same Greek word where in Malachi chapter 1, it's referred to as the oracle of the word of the Lord. And then in Nahum chapter 1, verse 1, the oracle of Nineveh, the book of the vision of Nahum. And then Habakkuk 1, the oracle of Habakkuk the prophets. And you notice it's that same Greek word that's translated logos that's used again in Romans chapter 3, verse 2. And then what you see happen immediately after that, in a couple of verses later, the Apostle Paul uses the term "it is written," and then ends up quoting Psalm chapter 51. And this term "it is written" is used in both the Old and the New Testament to refer to inspired books, and it's used 80 times or so in the New Testament to refer to books, and always refer to books that are in the Hebrew Bible. And then he goes on to quote not only the Psalms but also the book of Isaiah. And then he finishes up by talking about the righteousness of God has been manifested, being witnessed by the law and the prophets. So going back up, I found that in Romans chapter 3, verse 2, the oracles, is very clear that he's talking about the scriptures.
Yeah, and I think one of their greatest students of Scripture, Jerome came to the same conclusion that we need to begin with the single fountainhead, which he
Mhm.
understood was the Jews. Origen uses the same language and understanding, what had come down from the Jewish people. So I don't think this was, a real issue. Uh, the question that comes on, when we look at the Greek translations or the Syriac is, are those translations an exemplar of the oracles of God that was given unto the Jewish people?
Right. So, where I was thinking, would you want to go from here? I mean, would you want to talk about some of the different Greek translations? Because one of the things that is really focused on is the term the Septuagint or the 70. And as I like to remind people, that when it comes to the Septuagint in the early church, there wasn't just one Septuagint. I mean, there are different versions of the Septuagint. You see different books that are found, in the different versions of the Septuagint. As a matter of fact, let's see. Like at Oxyrhynchus, the Septuagint included the Apocalypse of Baruch that was found, First Enoch. Other versions included Third and Fourth Maccabees, Third Esdras, the Odes of Solomon, including the Prayer of Manasseh, the Psalms of Solomon, Psalm 151, and even the Ethiopian Orthodox, who's got a huge Bible. It includes Jubilees, some others, and other books that aren't found in any other Bibles, including Catholic, Protestant, and Eastern Orthodox.
Yeah, and I think it's important to understand that when Christianity came on scene, what we see in the scriptures very early on is the Christians were being kicked out of the synagogues.
Mhm.
So there was this division within the Jewish community and Christianity. So uh, you wouldn't see them just willfully just handing the Hebrew text to the Christian churches. And a byproduct of that is, the early Christian churches were put in possession of the Septuagint. If you think about it, they were uh, setting up ministries out to the Gentile nations. Um, this is something that would be much more easier to reach. But in that tradition itself, it does represent another tradition of Jewish writings that the Jews themselves state that are not part of their canon, and this is what we see now. One of the things that I brought up, and I tried to discuss a little bit more regarding Augustine, is Augustine is trying to deal with the political reality that the Greek churches and those in the West had received the Septuagint as if it was the only known version in history. They had no knowledge of the Jewish records as a whole. So their source of truth really began with the Septuagint. And as you talked about, there was not one Septuagint. We're talking about divergent, Greek Old Testament translation that was all over the place. I mean, Origin tried to really define out the divergent versions within the different Greek texts. We had the version of Aquila. We had the Theodosian version. Then you have the Septuagint. You have the Lucan edition, and they're all trying to make sense of the divergent canonical, not only the canonical but the textual tradition within itself. And this is why we see, within the Greek Orthodox Church and the Western Church coming up with a different division of what they consider a part of this Greek tradition. And the Greek Orthodox, they have 10. The Western Church accepts 7. Obviously, you have the Ethiopian Church that accepts Enoch. But if we understand it in the context that this is what the early Christian churches had to work with during a period of persecution. They didn't have any state rights to be recognized as a legal functioning religion of the state. This is what they had to work with as part of their missionary efforts until the study when Christianity became legal that Jerome was able to undertake with his team to really get to the bottom of this matter, which at that time you kind of wonder how much priority would have been given their recent fight with Arianism and trying to reunite the church. And all of a sudden, Jerome goes back to the Jews and starts investigating these issues. And as someone raised in the Western church that's used to these documents, he makes the empirical observation they don't have the books. They didn't say they banned them. They didn't say these are, unclean or horrible books. We don't use them, but they're not part of our canon. So he's doing the investigation, and the first thing he realizes they don't have these books. They don't know what we're talking about. And this is one of his initial arguments that he's making is, I'm making an empirical observation. They just don't have it. I'm over here to translate and it's not part of their works.
Right. A couple of things that usually pop up in the discussion about Jerome and the Septuagint, a lot of times people look at Jerome as being kind of the Lone Ranger, a soul that he's the only person or the first person that consider these books to be considered apocryphal or spurious or hidden books, which is what the term means. And the assumption that the version of the Septuagint in the first century during the time of Jesus, including these deuterocanonical books. So you want to kind of touch on this about Jerome being this only person during this time that viewed it this way, and whether or not the deuterocanonical books that were in later versions of the Septuagint, if there's any evidence that it was in the Septuagint in the first century or even before the time of Christ.
Well, first, I don't look at Jerome as a lone ranger. First, he had a complete team, so he had a full team. He had resources. He was well connected and networked around many in the Christian community. And so he was the first that actually really had the time and resources to really study this issue. Origen, who was involved in many different things, even though he did the hexapla, he had other priorities and things he was going. But Origen does recognize that there was books considered outside the Hebrew canon, and he actually, Eusebius just provide us with his quotation from the Psalms that shows, here are what I define as the 22, which is consistent with Josephus's account, with Jerome's understanding. But he says after that account, and then there are those outside this canon, and he refers to the book of Maccabees. So this is not a lone understanding. And if we look at Josephus very early on, he recognizes the works of the Hellenistic period, that there's these other writings, and the Tanaic literature that we see in the Talmud refers to external literature, works that are, while they're praised, they're read, they form no part of their particular canon. So this wasn't Jerome being a lone ranger. He had the resources, he had the time to actually investigate this issue, given that he's doing a work not only on the New Testament, but the Old as well.
Right. Oh, definitely. I mean, he had a big job ahead of him because he wanted to try to go back as far as possible. And I think he had mentioned that when he's translated from the Latin, he's a few translations away from the Hebrew, so he wanted to kind of have a fresh Latin translation that reflected that. And Jerome, like it says, I got up on the screen there, that's prologue to the commentary of Jonah. He said that Tobit is not in the canon, and we can talk a little bit about what the word. We've been throwing a lot of terms around here: canon, Septuagint, what all that means. And then the prologue to Jeremiah, he says, the book Baruch, we have omitted. I highlighted the word we. Who's the we that he's talking about? Well, he's talking about, those that are in the church, that he's a part of. And one thing that I had brought up in my debate against Trent is, and we're going to get to the early church councils in the 4th century, that the Council of Rome specifically, unlike the later councils of Hippo and Carthage, the Council of Rome enumerates every single book. I mean, it tells, like the 4 books of Kings, 2 books of Peter and such. And it talks about Jeremiah and its Ganoth, or its Lamentations. But what's interesting is that even though, even in the West as well as the East, the book of Baruch was considered to be part of Jeremiah because it was assumed that it was written by either Jeremiah or Baruch. We now know that's not true. It's interesting that he does not enumerate and separate the book of Baruch from the book of Jeremiah, like he does the book of Lamentations. And then I looked at this quote from his prologue, and he says, the book of Baruch, we don't omit it. And that would explain why it's not in the Council of Rome. And the same Bishop of Rome, Damasus I, who commissioned Jerome to translate the Vulgate, was also the same one that was at the Council of Rome that convened over that first council. And that's why we don't see the book of Baruch popping up in early versions of the Vulgate, as well as some codices as well. So, and the reason that's significant for is because you don't see consistency even in the 4th century church councils, as far as the exact number of books, as you do later in the ecumenical councils of Florence and Trent. Now, regarding the Deuterocannon in the 1st century in the Septuagint, do you want to touch on that?
Yeah, I think what's important to understand is these works have been part of the Jewish communities. There were writings. We look at Ben Syriac. It's Book of Proverbs. Good orders of living. And it was part of the Palestinian Jews in those communities. The Book of Maccabees, very early on, they sanctioned, that particular day to be part of their liturgy in Hanukkah. So these works came into being in the Hellenistic period. So we see the extensions of Daniel, Bel and the Dragon, Susanna. We see Baruch. We see all these works that come in during the Hellenistic period that are part of Jewish communities. They recognize them as external literature. They're part of their Jewish literature, but they distinguish them just like we do just like in my library. There's books that we hold in high esteem, and there's those that are not. So very early on, and we see this in the Tanaic literature, that they understand that the spirit of prophecy, something had left them where they felt like God stopped talking to them. So anything after that particular time, after the last prophets of Malachi, Haggai, it would have been blasphemous to add to their canon. And we see this throughout the Tanaic literature. So while yes, they did form part of the Septuagint, because if you think about the Jew or the Hellenistic Jews of that time, it kind of represents the writings of these times, and this is why you see come into the Greek translations. But nowhere do you see it come into the Orthodox Jewish canon, and we have to explain why is that. Why a work like Maccabees that was revered among their people.
Mhm.
I mean,
Yeah.
the Maccabean family, you know, I any word from the high priestly family, if anyone could have got these works in, it would have been the Maccabean family. But they didn't. They also understood that there was a difference between the works that should be included in the arcs, and then their historical writings, which while they use them as part in the Jewish literature, it's part of their communities. If it's not of equal weight with their canonical tradition, and the only thing that explains that is the fact that those works were never part of their canon, even though they do have use within their communities.
Right. One of the early church fathers that you had brought up, and when I was listening to the post-debate interview with Trent, was your use of Augustine. And it's one that is not just unique to yourself. I've heard other people use that argument as well as a witness for us. Or to kind of borrow from Gary Machuda, kind of a hostile witness.
Yes.
And for instance, in his book, The City to God, he says that the Holy Scripture is called canonical, but in others, the book of the Maccabees, these are held as canonical, not by the Jews, but by the church. And that's just reinforces what you're saying, that as late as the end of the 4th century, which is when Augustine is writing, the books of Maccabees were still not recognized by the Jews, as part of being in their canon at the time. It may have been part of the church, at least the church in the West. And I think that's something that needs to be emphasized, because the churches in the East didn't have identical canons as the church of the West, even as late in the 4th century. The other thing is from his work on Christian doctrine, when he talks about the 3 books of Solomon, which is Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon. And of those 2 books, Wisdom and Ecclesiasticus, which is also known as Sirach, which are in the Catholic Old Testament, they were written by Jesus Sirach. And of course, it's just Augustine. This is his opinion. He later recants this and realizes that that wisdom couldn't have been written by Ben Sirach at that time. But touch on that. Explain why Augustine and his reasoning for maybe the difference between what he considered to be canonical and edifying books that are considered like church books, but not actually part of the canon. And then as well as talking about why the identification of who wrote these books is important in terms of the 4th century, why they would have been included in the canon to begin with.
Yeah, no, and that's a really good point. And I think we do have to understand that there was a political reality. There was many Greeks in his congregation who had grew up, born and raised. In some ways, it's sort of the King James version of their day, in the sense that they grew up with the Septuagint,
Yeah.
and the very thought that there was going to be any change or move off of that translation sparked fear. And we see this very early on with Jerome's translation of Jonah, where he changed gourd to ivy. And he lays out his reasons for it in going to the Hebrew writings. And what Augustine says, which obviously impacted his thinking, you're causing trouble with this. The Greeks in my congregation were so upset. They rioted. They went out and grabbed a Jew right away to see, hey, what's the real writing? Because they had heard, it read from the Septuagint for all these generations. So when you come in here and you change it up, it's just causing trouble. So
Mhm.
Augustine is trying to maintain the political environment. We're trying to get to a point of peace here after dealing with the Arians and all this persecution the church is going to. Here's now a time for peace. But what's interesting about Augustine's writings is he obviously understands, if we look at his Contra Faustus, if we look at his work against the Manichaeans, he has a real good, strong grounding in how do we understand what's from historical authors. But I think what's important is when we look at the Council of Carthage, it says something specific. It says, these we include as canonical, that which has been received by the fathers to be read in the church. So when we look at that, it's canonical in the sense that these are the works that should be received. But there's a distinction in there as what is going to be our measure of faith. And I think when we look at the learned opinion that comes down through the ages, we see this kind of consistent testimony that they understand that it's part of their tradition that they had received as part of these communities. They had all they had known is the Septuagint. So, it's like, hey, by the way, the Hebrews actually, have scriptures too. Uh, and, most of his congregation didn't even know about all the other Greek translations that were out there as well, that there
Right.
was all these differences. So, you know, it's a safe bet. It's sort of the King James version of their particular day. And Jerome is coming in and trying to say, no, we did the investigation, and this is the exemplar of the Jewish canon. So he's taking a much more political stance on this particular issue. But in the confession at Carthage, it says, "Hey, these are the books that we received by the fathers to be read," and we, at least in the Anglican Communion, define that as, well, yeah, we understand these are historical works, just like if we're reading from John Calvin or Martin Luther or sermons from John Chrysostom.
Hmm.
But there's a different set of works that are going to be the measure of our faith. So while they're read for edification, from growth, they were read to the catechumens. Uh, the ancient church, and we see a consistent learned opinion come, is that these works are separated out from those that are going to be our measure of our faith. And I think we see this consistent methodology in Augustine.
Hmm.
Obviously, we see it in you know Jerome, and we see it down through the ages, even among some of the most learned Catholics during the Reformation that investigated the same issue with Cardinal Cajetan
Hmm.
and Cardinal Jimenez, who
Yeah.
was doing a textual work to bring back the official writings of Scripture. He came to this same conclusion. Cardinal Cajetan came to the same conclusion, and these were opponents of Protestantism as a whole. So
Right.
for them to side with this opinion, who had been sanctioned by the popes of their day, who had tremendous influence and were astute on this subject. How do we explain that when any real serious investigation is done into this issue, this is the conclusion that we're getting? And we see that with the Protestants and the Reformation as well. They started going back to the Hebrew canon. I mean, they were raised on the Vulgate. What do you expect for them to initially be influenced on? But when they went back to the Hebrew, this is the conclusion that they draw, that these works should be separated out, and only be read as part of the liturgy, for edification of the people, not for the establishment of doctrine.
Right. And one of the things, going back to the whole use of the word apocrypha and making it sound like Jerome was really the only one that actually had used it. One of the things I had mentioned in my book, that the term is used for one or all of these books even before the time of Jerome. Julius Africanus referred to the book of Susanna, which is one of the Greek translations of Daniel. I refer to it as spurious, which he got into it, I think, with Origen, I think, later about
Hmm.
it. But the point is, you're talking late second century that he's writing. Athanasius considered at least first and second Maccabees to be considered apocrypha, because he has this like three-tiered system, which I find kind of funny, because if you look at his three-tiered system, there are books in it, such as the Didache and the Shepherd of Hermas, which is in his second tier, which he says are to be read, but are not to be a doctrine to be based on it, like in his first tier. And in his first year, he's got all the books of the Proto-Canon, except for, I think, Esther. Is in the second tier, and he includes the book of Baruch, because again, at that point, by the late fourth century, Baruch was considered to believe to be part of Jeremiah, even though it wasn't. What's funny, in that second tier, where it has most of the deuterocanonical books, it includes the Didache and the Shepherd of Hermas. And then in the third tier, which he calls apocrypha, he has first and second Maccabees, thus supporting Augustine that it wasn't part of the canon of the Jews. Even as late as the fourth century. And then you had mentioned about Cardinal Cajetan, as late as the Reformation. In his commentary of the Book of Esther, he refers to these books as being apocrypha. And Cardinal Cajetan, like you said, was no friend of the Reformation. He was no friend to Luther. In fact, he was a cardinal that had interviewed Luther, and they really went head to head into it. So, and then there was something called Glossa Ordinaria in the late Middle Ages, and that was kind of the official study Bible of Catholics. And every one of the deuterocanonical books, including the Greek additions to Esther and Daniel, they called apocrypha and said, this is not in the canon, this is not in the canon, this is not in the canon. So Jerome is not not on his own here.
No, and we see that consistent witness throughout church history, that it comes to this same learned position when they actually had the time to actually investigate this question and do their homework on it. This is what we see. And this is consistent with what Josephus is saying at the end of the first century. He's making the same illustration that there was those books that are going to be the measure of our faith, and there are those, while they do represent the history of the Jews,
Mhm.
they're not placed on the same level. They're given a secondary status, despite how influential you would think something like the Maccabees or even the Book of Judith, would be part of it. And I think we have to explain that and also understand, at this particular point in time, why is there a change in position on this particular question that we see happening in the Reformation, and we see a consistent learned position on this issue and how we should understand the canonical or the apocrypha uh, down through the Middle Ages up until this point.
Right. So one of the questions that I've always wondered, and this is a question I'm actually asking to you too, is do you know of any Jew or Jewish group, either prior to or contemporary with the time of Christ, or even into the early church age, talk maybe second century, maybe third century, that had embraced all of the books that are found in the Catholic Old Testament, like you can with the books in the Protestant Old Testament? Like, for instance, you had brought up about Baba Bathra, and for the people that don't know what that is, Baba Bathra is a Beretta. It's a kind of a written tradition that was written down in the second century, around the same time as the Midrash, like time period or so. And it has all of the books that you find in the Catholic Old Testament, including the Book of Esther and some of those questionable books like Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon. And they're actually listed that way. And then by the time you get to Origin, you also have Origin having all of these same books in the Old Testament. And I found out later it would even embrace the same 27 New Testament books, which Rufinus later quotes about it. So people say, well, what's the earliest uh, Old Testament canon that matches Protestants? Well, that would be Baba Bathra as far as the list. And as far as the New Testament, I would have to say that would be Origen in the early third century. So do you want to touch on that a little bit as well, or?
Yeah, and I think that's very important because they do speak on this particular issue. And I think one of the points I did raise with Trent, because even though he'll try to place, the Babylonian Talmud at a much later point in history, those writings are based on much earlier records.
Right, right.
Josephus goes in the very beginning of his writings that he's basing his works on the Jewish archives. We do understand from his antiquities, he does lay out their process for how the different groups, their priests or the Levites, how they collected their records. Very similar to other ancient civilizations. With the Babylonians, their priests were in charge of documentation, and in times of war they would make copies of their collections and make sure they had it for the people. So even though they were all spread out, they had the same thing. So these records, while it's officially published after the second century, it is based on records that go much further back into the Jewish archive, so we have to take that into consideration. So they specifically speak on the books, they give the names, they talk about how they were compiled. They address a lot of specific questions, on the end of the book of Deuteronomy and Samuel. They get into very specific detail, and there's really no dispute about this. And what they also do is they do bring up questions about certain books, like Ben Sira,
Mhm.
and the other works written from then on, that do not defile the hands. So they speak about that,
Yeah.
especially, and what they kind of show is we have these external books that are a part of our Jewish heritage. It's part of our liturgy. There's some good information. We understand that the Palestinian Jews, it's like a book of Proverbs. It was written originally in Hebrew. It would obviously, get a lot of attention in their communities, but yet we don't find that in the particular canon, and they do speak about that. They do speak. Rabbi Akivi says, one who reads the external literature. So they understand about this distinction that they have in there, and they also speak about all these external works, or those that are recited or taught orally, but works that are distinct from their particular canon. So we have a lot of history from the Jews, and part of the conversations that Jerome is sharing with us is actual testimony from the Jewish people at that particular time. And if you think about Josephus, first, many of them considered him a traitor at the particular time. So we have
Yeah.
Jews of a later age coming to the same conclusion of Josephus. And Jerome makes this argument, when he's talking about the various editions of Daniel. He says, they say this forms no part of their canon. They don't say they're horrible books or they banned them at any point in history. And we have to understand, that we're getting this testimony from the Jews of Jerome's time. Josephus is giving us a history of what we expect to see. And in some ways, the Christians that are sort of interacting with these communities are representing a canon that is consistent with our Protestant listings. And all these investigations or studies are coming to basically the same conclusion when they look at these works.
Right. And I'm glad you brought up about Josephus being a historian, because for those of us living in the West and in the 21st century, when we think about somebody writing something, we just assume that they might be writing about their opinion or what is taking place in their time. But when we're talking about the Middle East, in Israel, and in the first century, when historians are writing, they're reflecting not just what's going on in their time period or the belief in their time period, but much, much earlier. So Josephus is, when he's talking about this only 22 books, and I had this up on the screen earlier, and I'll bring it up here. He talks about these only 22 books, of that every Jew knew since that they've been born, which obviously he's not being literal. This is hyperbole. It's like saying, well, I've been a Christian since I was born. Well, I was raised Roman Catholic. That's actually not true. When you're a Roman Catholic, you become part of the church when you're baptized, not
Yes.
when you're born. So he's I think Trent referred to it as gross exaggeration, but all he's trying to get across, the point I think that is missed, is that he's trying to say everybody knows what is in this Jewish canon because it goes way far back. And then he mentions these only 22 books, and then he breaks them down, the 5 books of Moses, and then these 13 books, which are from the time of Moses to the death of Artaxerxes, which is right around the time of Malachi, like around 120ish, or 420 BC or so.
Mhm.
And then the 4 hymns of God, which is obviously the Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon, because that would have been written during this time period. So one of the questions and objections I often hear is that we can't know what these 22 books are that Josephus is talking about. Could you touch on that? Can we know for certain what these 22 books are based on the testimony of Josephus, since Josephus doesn't enumerate all 22 books? He enumerates most of them, but can we be certain what these books are?
Well, yeah, because it's not just dependent on Josephus. Now he's once again he's a court historian,
Hmm.
and he did. And one of the points I did bring out to um, Trent to kind of combat his exaggeration of Josephus was there was another historian at that time, Justin of Tiberias, who opposed uh, Josephus. So anything he would have said that was out of context, that was not part of their canonical tradition, would have been met with a swift response, given Josephus's perception among the Jewish communities at that particular time. But we do have empirical observation because the Jews are community spread wide and far. They're in Babylon, they're in Yemen, they're in Egypt. Obviously, at that particular time, they were still in Jerusalem, spread out. And so we have the witness of these particular groups. And that's why when Jerome is giving us testimony from the fourth century of this is what the Jews are saying. They're descended from that same canonical tradition, and what we see is we're seeing the same testimony because we know they have differences. I mean, there's two oral traditions within the Jewish communities. They have the Palestinian or the Jerusalem and the Babylonian, and
Right.
there's two separate distinct traditions of their oral law. But
Mhm.
both groups, even though they accept a different oral tradition, they accept the same canon. And what explains that? And so when we look at uh, apart from Josephus, and Josephus makes an empirical observation. He says, just look out. The Jews have never changed. They've stuck firm on this canon. And we see that first. We don't see any of the Hellenistic works actually getting in there. And then when we look at the Jewish communities as a whole throughout the ancient world, this is the only canon that they come up with. They don't say, yeah, at one point, Book of Maccabees, Judith, Ben Sira, they're all part of canon, and we all came together and said, no, these aren't going to be part. And none of the church fathers ever say, even Augustine, he doesn't say, no, the Jews banned it because Christians were starting to quote from this, so let's just get it out. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I think the
Good.
only thing that Trent brought up was about the Ethiopian Jews, as if we actually really know the real history or origins of this group. And
I would
are
be
they,
about that.
yeah, I mean, are the Ethiopian Jews, and there's about 16 different theories on their true origin.
Oh wow.
So we really don't know, are they part of one of the lost tribes of Israel? Is there a reference in Exodus about their communication with the Ethiopians at that time? So there's literally 12 to 16 different theories. Uh, our earliest attestation about this group and their understanding really comes in the 1800s when they go out and they officially see this group, but we don't really know no history. And to point to them as the exemplar of the Jewish community as a whole that doesn't witness to it, um, doesn't make a very strong case, given we don't know who the provenance of or where this group is really descended from. To say, I mean, are they a group that went into exile? Did they fall off during the Assyrian invasion? We just don't know. So, what credibility do they have in being the true witnesses and guardians of their oracles?
Yeah. It seems like there's a bit of being anachronistic as far as saying, okay, this is what they're embracing now, and you're talking about the 18th century, and so this is what these Jews believed back in the first century before the time of Christ. Sort of like assuming that the books that are in the Septuagint or whatever version of the Septuagint you're talking about, that the Deuterocanonical books were also in the books or in the same version of the Septuagint during the time of Christ. I mean, that seems to be anachronistic, and I think it's kind of a hard sell. The closest that I've seen anyone mention anything was about the Kaigai recension, and I think Trent might have brought that up. And the Kaigai recension was right around the turn of the century, the 1 BC to 1 AD or so, where there were Pharisees in Alexandria who had added the book of Sirach into the Septuagint. And there's a few problems with this. Just because a book is in the Septuagint, that doesn't mean that they consider it inspired. And I gave examples of that even in the church age, or books that were in the different versions of the Septuagint. Doesn't mean those communities consider them to be inspired. Plus, this is taking place in Alexandria, not in Israel, where it would be pertinent. And are you familiar with a Roman Catholic scholar by the name of John Martinoni?
I am not.
Okay, I had dialogue with him a couple years ago when I was in the process of writing my book, and one of the things that he had shared with me is that the Septuagint, according to the letter of Aristeas, would start like around 250 or so BC and was limited to the five books of Moses, and then eventually the rest of the Hebrew Bible got translated. And he had asserted that around 134 BC is when the Septuagint was completed, and that's significant because most of the deuterocanonical books were written after that. They were written and or translated into Greek after that, including Sirach, because Sirach wasn't originally written in Greek. It was translated by his grandson later, but he translated anywhere between like 120 to 132 BC. So it would have been after that, after the Septuagint was completed. So any books that might have been added, including the book of Baruch, it wouldn't have been part of that original Septuagint that had been closed during that time.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point. I was hoping to sort of get into that around the Septuagint because, the testimony that we have from Philo, from the Talmud itself, and from Josephus, that under Ptolemy II, they only reference the first five books.
Hmm.
That Ptolemy, obviously, he now has he's now over the Jews, Egypt. And he's trying to understand all these civilizations to better govern them. One of his librarians says, "Hey, I think we need this book, the Torah itself, to get
Hmm.
translated and published at the Library of Alexandria." And uh, while the letter of Aristeas has some interesting information,
Hmm.
Josephus, Philo, and the Talmud itself makes reference to the work that was, or the translation that was done under Ptolemy II, and that was thereby published at the Library of Alexandria. And it only mentions the Torah,
Yeah.
which then leads us to believe, these other works. And when we look at the translations of the Torah, we do see some consistency in the Greek and the Hebrew and these translations. But once we step away from the Torah, all these other works are all over the place, which shows that there was really no uniformed effort in putting these collections or doing some translation together, which explains why we have uh, Theodosian's version and all the differences in the Septuagint. So, which goes to say, when did these works come in? They weren't part of that official effort. So they probably didn't really have any sanction except among the Hellenistic Jews, which found those works of great interest. I mean, especially the Maccabees. We just defeated the Macedonian army. Why not praise that? So.
And yet you don't find the Maccabees in the Hebrew Bible or any Bible of the Jews, even up to like the fourth century. You would think of any book that would have been in there, it would have been the Maccabees.
Yes, and I did raise that question not only to Trent, but in my discussion with John J. Collins. I was like, and we were discussing the book of Daniel. I was like, how does a book, like Daniel, interpreter of dreams, gets into the canon, even
Hmm.
though it was later moved to the writings? How does that get in? But, one of their greatest military defeats since King David doesn't. And uh, Collins understood that was a tricky one to have to explain. How does that get in there? His thing was, well, they didn't want to offend the Greeks, by putting it into the canon. But I was like, well, but they made it a national holiday. They were mocking the Greeks every single year from the time of Judas Maccabeus, who said this is going to be a law, this is going to be observed. It's in the Jewish scroll of fasting. It's going to be in our liturgy. So what's the difference? They're mocking them every year at Hanukkah. They were saying it was going to be celebrated. We see Jesus celebrating the Festival of Lights. So But he basically didn't have an answer to that question, because why wouldn't they put it in? I mean, it supports, especially in Second Maccabees, prayers for the dead, which is
Yeah.
part of the Jewish liturgy. There's
Yeah.
nothing, there's nothing contrary that they would say, well, the Christians are using it, we can't use it. This is their greatest military battle. If anything's going to go in there, it'll be that one. And this is where I think the Roman Catholic Church has a difficulty explaining, you know, um, how do you reconcile, your count with what Josephus, Origen, and others? When we come down to this 22, yeah, you can make some questions about Esther, but we do have responses to that from the Jewish community. How do you reconcile all these other works with that particular number? You
Right.
just can't.
Yeah, and just to kind of piggyback on what you said about Esther, I did my own research about this because I've got two Catholic translations, older ones of the Bible. The one is the New American Bible, which is the Catholic Bible from the 70s, not to be confused with the New American Standard. This is a Catholic translation, and the New Catholic version. This is my great grandmother's Bible, um, and there was a point that I wanted to make, but. Um, Actually, I lost my train of thought. Oh, the book of Esther. And what's kind of interesting is that the New Catholic version of the Bible follows the Douay Rheims, which is the English translation of the Bible, back in the 1600s, where the additions to Esther are added on to chapter 10 of Esther. But the New American Bible does this really weird thing in between the chapter numbers. They have these chapter letters that go in between, like, because what you see from the additions is that the additions to Esther don't go chronologically after chapter 10. So they're trying to fit it in like where it's supposed to be. And it makes it really clear that this was written much, much later. And the other thing, and Trent brought this up too, is in the book of Esther, you don't find the name of God at all. I mean, at all in those 10 chapters of the original Hebrew and Aramaic. You don't find it in the Song of Solomon either, so it's not really that big of a deal. But what's interesting is when you get to the Greek editions to Esther, in 104 verses or 107 verses, God is mentioned like 45 times. It's like every 2.5 verses. So he goes from the writer of Esther goes from not mentioning God at all to mentioning him every 2.5 verses. So it's really clear that this was something that was added much later, during the Hellenistic period. It wasn't written during the time when it was originally written, because a lot of people believe that Mordecai might have actually written it based on I think chapter 10. There's some implication there, but regardless of who read it, who wrote it, it's very clear that this was written much later, especially with all those additions to God. The other thing that you had mentioned about, and I'll put it up on the screen here, is a prologue to Sirach, because one of the things that arguments people make was that there wasn't a threefold division like there is today. The law, the prophets, and the writings. Prior to the time of Christ, and yet the prologue of Sirach does seem to imply that when the grandson writes that these books were handed down to us through the law of the prophets and the later authors, or the rest of the books of our ancestors. And in my New American Bible, under the footnote, it says that these books were according to the threefold division of the present Hebrew Bible. So would you say that the law, the prophets, and the rest of these books would have been the books that we know today, which is referred to as the Tanakh, or the Hebrew Bible?
Yeah, it's consistent with it, and that's what we're looking for in these writings, especially with Josephus. Now you have this threefold division, in the prologue, and everything's consistent. And I think what happens in these discussions is they're looking for identical witness testimony, and we never see that in any case. There's obviously a perspective that they're bringing to their writings, but what we see is a consistency. So what we see in Josephus squares away or reconciles what we see in the prologue with this division. And then when you take and you add the other Jewish literature from Bava Batra, then everything starts making sense, because then it sort of complements that testimony. It gives you a little more different information. Okay, well, here are what the writings are. Here's what the prophets are, and here's these works. So when we build our case from different independent sources, they're basically saying the same thing. They're coming up with the same number of works. And
Hmm.
one of the things that gets lost in this conversation is he said 22, not 29 or 30. So the problem is not for us Protestants on this particular issue, because we can reconcile, Jeremiah and Lamentations as one.
Right.
We can see this with Ruth and Judges too, and Origen makes this observation in his list that they were combined. Um, but we can't get to the magic number of 29 or 30 or 33 with this division that we see in the Jewish group. It just doesn't reconcile. Our numbers and what our canons say reconcile very consistently with the different historical sources.
Right. We tend to see in the early church, and honestly, even before the time of Christ, by the Book of Jubilees, you see either 22 or 24 books. You'd mentioned about origin, and one of the things that was brought up in Trent's post-debate discussion is that how do you get to 22 books? And one of the arguments is that the Book of Ruth and the Book of Judges were combined, just like Jeremiah and Lamentations would have been combined. And they've made the comments, and I've heard during the discussion that you don't find Ruth um, and Judges actually combined in any early canonical list. Well, if you go to Origin, yeah, you do. Ruth and Judges are combined, and he's reflecting, a Jewish canon at that time. Again, Baba Batra, you end up finding, the 5 books of Moses, 19, that makes 24 books. You find Josephus that you had mentioned about. There's a book called Fourth Esdras that's
Yes,
written around
the
the same time as
24.
Josephus, and he talks about this 414 books, or 94 books, so people can get the idea in their head, and to keep 70 and deliver them to the wise. But these other 24 books, the 94 minus 70, these 24 books are to be published openly, and they're referred to as the spring of understanding, the fountain of wisdom, the stream of knowledge. So do you want to touch on the difference between the 22 and 24 books, and what seems to be the earliest tradition? And is there really that big of a difference between the two? Because there are some people that think that they're talking about two different canons.
No, there really isn't at all, because it really comes down to, do we include as part of the division? Ruth was a judge.
Hmm. Yeah.
When we look at Lamentations are from Jeremiah, so it's very consistent with what we see. And we do understand that, for church usage and how it's set up, how you're going to use it as part of church service. But whether we look at the 22 or 24, we can easily reconcile those numbers with the Jewish records. And the key part that Origin does say is, these are the 20 books as handed down by the Jews. And we actually have, an actual observation that he's connecting with the Jewish canonical tradition that placed Ezra, or not Ezra, that actually placed Jeremiah and Lamentations and Ruth along with Judges. And that's consistent. It's not like Ruth is found in the book of Daniel. She was a judge. Lamentations. The interesting part is, what we see was Baruch. Baruch was his scribe, but still, this is a work, or the letter of Jeremiah, which the Jews do not include in there. So, in terms of the 22 or 24, it's all consistent. Whether one group decided to include Ruth with Judges and Jeremiah with Lamentations, and another group, within the Jewish community, separated it out as it's to be read separately, it's still the same work. I mean, you still
Right.
have the same number of pages. it's the same thing. It's really, I think they're trying to frame an argument that, oh, there's differences. No, it's, what parts are you reading to your congregation? Are you classifying them together? Remember, the Jews originally, or Josephus did place Daniel among the prophets, and then
Mhm.
later on they moved him to the writings, probably
Right.
because of Christianity. But we do see this change in division among the Jewish people. But what we don't see is all these other writings getting in, or a point in time where they were removing these 7 or 10 or 15 different writings from their particular books.
Right. And right now we're about at the 1 hour 10 minute appointed time. I would like to get some questions in because there have been a lot of questions that popped up in the chat. So praise God for that. If anybody in the chat is listening, if you want any other questions, I've starred the ones that are in there, and we'll do our best to answer them. There's one other point I want to kind of bring up because it's significant, is that we have to remember who were the group of Jews that laid the books up in the temple. Because when you read First Maccabees, it says that Judas Maccabeus had gathered together all of the books from his ancestors, and those books then would have been laid up in the temple. And a lot of people think that it might have been the Pharisees that did it. It wasn't. It was actually the Sadducees. And one of the beliefs is that the Sadducees only believed in the 5 books of Moses, and this is something that was brought up in my debate against Trent. But that's based on a misunderstanding of Origen, who had conflated the Sadducees with the Samaritans, which you had mentioned in a debate that the Samaritans only believed in the Pentateuch, those 5 books. But we have evidence from the New Testament as well as from Jewish literature that they actually believed in more than that. And since they were the ones that were laying books up in the temple, they would not have laid books up in the temple they didn't consider to be inspired scripture. And here's just a couple examples of them. In addition to the Torah, when Matthew's talking with the Sadducees, he quotes Jonah, so it wouldn't make any sense to them if he's quoting Jonah, to rebuke them. Matthew 26, he quotes Daniel. Luke 22, he quotes the Psalms. The Apostle Paul, when he's talking to the high priest in Acts 23, he quotes Ezekiel by calling him a whitewashed tomb. And the Midrash actually quotes Job and actually or Joshua, I think, and calls it that the scriptures were laid up in the temple, and he specifically mentions the book of Joshua. And these are books that are not in the 5 books of Moses. They're books that are part of the prophets as well as the writings. And then one of the other things that was brought up was, well, when Jesus is talking with the Sadducees, he refers to the Torah, about the resurrection. Why wouldn't he have mentioned like Daniel or some other books in the prophets? But we have to remember that the Sadducees also believed in angels, and the Torah
Yeah.
talks about angels. So that's not really a good argument. Rather, they're quoting from the Torah. So obviously Jesus is responding to them from the Torah. So you want to talk a little bit about that, about the different canon theories and between the different Jewish groups.
Yeah, and and here's the important thing. I think it goes before Origin, and I think this is where they're getting it from Josephus.
Mhm.
In his Antiquities, Josephus makes a statement which, I understand how they try to draw this out, and maybe this is where Origin and others are getting. But Josephus states that the Sadducees omit no observance at all apart from the laws.
And just
Um,
to quickly interrupt you, when he talking about the laws, is he talking about the 5 books of Moses, or is he just talking about like the 10 Commandments or the 613 laws that are in the Old Testament?
Yeah, and that's the thing, obviously there are laws laid out. The prophets are, repeating from, the Torah as well. So it's not clear, but when we look at Josephus as a whole, he obviously understands the different groups. He does list them out, but he still recognizes them with part of the Orthodox Jewish canonical tradition. So while we do understand that the Samaritans obviously only accepted, uh, the old,
Right, right,
or the Torah,
right.
but Josephus is pretty clear that the Orthodox Jewish community, which he does list out the Sadducees in other sections among the various groups, represent this canonical tradition. So I don't see this particular verse from the Antiquities would be inconsistent with what we find in Contra Appian. So I think that's where it really goes. It's trying to interpret something that just isn't there. Obviously, he's not talking about the canonical tradition, but they obviously had a set of laws that they adhered to, that they interpreted. So I, I think this is really the root of the discussion where they're trying to draw it from, and then they're taking statements from the fathers that obviously are drawing on Josephus to come to this conclusion. But this is all we have to work on to draw that conclusion from. I don't think there's enough evidence to support that conclusion.
Right. And one of the things that is brought up too is about even the Pharisees, whether or not the Pharisees had a set canon or not, because there's a difference between the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai. The
Mhm.
school of Shammai was more skeptical. The way I would look at it, that would be no different than Catholics like Cajetan and Ximenes during the Reformation, who were Roman Catholic. They didn't join the Reformation, and they had questions, and they doubted the books, of the Deuterocannon while affirming the while affirming the Proto-Canon or the Hebrew Bible. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't any like Catholic canon, during that period of time. Um, and we had touched on the Sadducees as well. We don't have time to get into the Essenes. That's a whole nother ball of wax. But you feel like taking some questions, Jonathan?
Yeah, no, that sounds good. The only thing I want to bring up about the Essenes, because I know
Yeah,
Trent sort of tried to lay a foundation, and I did speak with a number of scholars that are familiar, with that Dead Sea Scroll literature. But once again, we're investigating, or what they're finding is a library from a Jewish community. They don't know if it's the Essenes, and they find
right.
these other works along with them. It's like if I was buried. And 2,000 years later, you find my library. You can't put everything in the same classification. And the scholars that I asked on this particular issue, Dr. Matthew Monger, who specializes in this, worked on that literature, said there's no indication that they considered these as part of scripture. There's all this other work in there that would have to be included in there, that would have to then say, okay, is all this canonical as well? So just wanted
Right.
to touch real quick on the Essenes.
Yeah, exactly. Because one of the arguments was that they considered the book of Sirach to be at the same level as the rest of the book, as well as the other Deuterocanon. Just a quick point here: the only books that were actually found, the Deuterocanonical books that were found, was I think Sirach and I think Tobit, now possibly Wisdom 1 and 2, and I think a Greek translation of the Epistle of Jeremiah.
Yes.
You can find all of the books, all of the Deuterocanonical books in there. Are you familiar with Roger Beckwith? Because I know he was brought up during your debate.
Sort of familiar. I haven't read too much of his
Yeah,
stuff.
he's got a wonderful book. I've actually got it right here. I mean, you can't really see it because of the thing, but I don't think you can actually, or is it upside? It's upside down. Yeah, the Old Testament canon of the New Testament Church by Roger Beckwith. I mean, it is a must-have book. And in his first appendix, he talks about the scrolls from Cairo, Geniza, and the meaning of the term fifths, because it talks about the law of the prophets and the fifths, and what the fifths actually refer to are not just the Psalms, even because the Psalms are broken into 5 different sections, but the writings as a whole. And he talks about how the Essenes, or whoever it was that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, uh, they discern between certain books, like especially the 5 books of Moses, based on hand breaths and finger breaths and columns and everything. And we don't have time to talk to it here, but they were very specific about those type of books compared to other books that were found in their canon. But let's start with some of these questions here. How you doing on time right now, Jonathan?
I'm doing fine. Everything is good over here.
Okay, good. Well, first of all, this is from Mike AD. Says I just subbed to Jonathan's channel, so thank you, Mike AD, for that. God bless you for that. So let's kind of go in order here. The first one is going to be Michael Harrington. Michael Harrington is a gentleman. He's a Roman Catholic who I'm going to be debating on the Marian dogma. So I'm looking forward to that. So Michael, thank you for your multi-part question. The first question, let's take them individually here for Michael. Is the canon infallible?
The canon is infallible. People are infallible. I
Mhm.
think once again we understand that that there's a number of councils that have erred. And we wouldn't say this was done in a malicious way. But there's a number of ancient and local councils that have erred on issue, which shows that they are deemed infallible. But the question of the canon or oracles of God that was received within the Jews, the history of their canon, and God does reveal that, not only internally but externally as well. His creation is a witness to His word, and given that we have the ability to look at the Jews in from Babylon, Yemen, Egypt, Jerusalem, all over, and all these independent groups witness to the same common history that would be conclusive in any normal court of law.
Right.
So, while councils and groups are infallible, the independent testimony over these, divergent groups that have different views and different oral traditions, that would be conclusive. And that's what we can trust.
Right. And the second part of this question is, if the canon is infallible, depending on how you define the term, does this contradict sola scriptura? And before answering that question, I think we need to understand and to maybe define what that actually means. Sola scriptura simply means that the scriptures alone are the only infallible, inspired revelation for God, for Christian doctrine and truth. That doesn't mean that we can't discern from outside sources about different things. It's just saying that the scriptures, not the truth, who are made up of fallible men, including councils, which you have correctly stated have erred before. That was Luther's issues at the Diet of Worms, because he says popes and councils have erred. Even ecumenical councils have contradicted each other. So he says he would only recant if it could be demonstrating him from the scriptures or from plain reason, which they weren't able to do at that point because they were just looking to convict Luther and not have a debate with them. So no, if the canon is infallible, meaning that it's God breathed, and we can know what the canon is it has nothing to do with sola scriptura, because the formation of the canon is the church recognizing that God, allowing the church to recognizing what books are come from Him and are inspired versus ones that aren't, but it has nothing to do with sola scriptura. Do you want to touch on that point?
Yeah, so we're establishing our measure, and and I think Romans 3:2 establishes that fountainhead, that measure for our basis on this particular question. So, that which was received among the Jews, or their canon, and the biblical injunction that we receive in the canon directs us to that particular source. So, yeah, in that regard, it doesn't contradict it at all.
No, and I think that kind of answers the last two questions that he brought up as well. It's kind of covered. A book I think that Michael, that you might be interested in, and I don't know if you've seen this or not, but it's Canon Revisited. It's by Dr. Michael Kruger, about the New Testament canon at all. And like I said, you might agree, you might disagree at all, but he refutes the idea of the canon being determined or discovered at canons or by early church lists, about the New Testament canon, but rather it's a self-authentication model that you can look at the scriptures themselves and see that these books, are God breathed, and that God simply allowed the church and His people to recognize what these books are because of the internal qualities that these books have that no other piece of literature has, including like First Clement, the Didache, the Shepherd, even the letters of Ignatius. That there's certain qualities that they have. I mean, it's not an easy read, but it's one that I know Jonathan definitely would be able to understand. And knowing him, he'd probably be able to read it in one night. It took me a while. I had to eat it in chunks. But there's something I wanted to share both with Michael and with Jonathan, and it's on page 256, and it's talking about the codices. And codices were kind of like early book forms, because originally scripture was written on scrolls, and then later on, to make it easier, they put it in like kind of book forms and everything like that. and it talks about the different sizes of codices. And it says that miniature codices were quite popular among early Christians, and it indicated that a book was for private or portable use. But larger codices were created for use in the public worship of the church. So these would have been books that were considered inspired, and you see the New Testament writers being our New Testament codices, including these New Testament books. And it says, and it goes down in the footnote, it says that examples of apocryphal material in miniature codices, meaning books that weren't used in public worship, include the Shepherd of Hermas, the Acts of Peter, the Proto-Evangelium of James, and several other ones. And then he also notes Bell and the Dragon. Bell and Dragon is one of the Greek translations of Daniel, the additions to Daniel. So that was in a miniature codice. And the Book of Tobit was also a miniature codice. So you're finding, well into the early church age, you're finding these apocryphal or deuterocanonical books to be in these miniature these miniature codices that were not used in public worship of the church, no more than books like the Proto-Evangelium James and the Shepherd of Hermas and others were. So it's definitely a must. I enjoyed reading it. It would be like the New Testament equivalent of Beckwith's book on the Old Testament. So, ready for another question?
Yes.
Okay, I think you might know this guy, James Sheffield. All the books of the New Testament, as they are commonly received, we do receive and account them canonical. 39 articles of religion. You want to touch on that? Because I know that was brought up during the debate.
Yeah, when and this is our definition, obviously, against the Church of Rome that we published, or the Church of England published in 1562, where we specifically define, those particular works of the Apocrypha as separated out from the canonical. Now, they're canonical in the sense that they were received by the church to be read for the edification, but not to be established as a measure for our doctrine or their faith. So, here is the official response by the Church of England to the Roman Catholic Church during that period of time, where we basically define, and we do quote Jerome in that particular instance in our article to show that this was the historical understanding of these books, and we are going to stand by that decision, which has come down to us. So, and commonly received, that it really goes back to that argument where these independent Jewish communities all come up with these same books. And how else do we explain that fact? Is this is the Orthodox Jewish canon, which we are representing in our Protestant confessions.
Right. And in my book, even though it was on the Old Testament, I had a chapter on there about the New Testament. I had mentioned, I think it might have been Tertullian, who made the comment about the churches, like in the 2nd century, still having the chairs or whatever of the apostles.
Yes, in
And
his prescription against heretics,
yeah,
he talks about. So he's making an empirical observation. He says, "Go out and look for yourselves, and you will see the official writings of these churches." And and that's sort of what we see when we look at the Jewish synagogues throughout the world. This is the only records that we see.
right. Okay. All right. So thank you for that, James. Next one is from Justice399. Hi, Justice. Are we really missing anything with our 66 book canon? What have these groups gained with a larger canon? Good question.
Well, I think so. Are we missing anything? So let's talk about the Deuterocanonical. Obviously, there's a period of Jewish history that's obviously inspiring. It really talks about the history of the Jewish people, the rise of this Hellenistic thought that we get to see, especially with Bell and the Dragon or
Mhm.
Susanna. So we do get tremendous insight into the intellectual development of the Hellenized Jews. We get to see the sort of preparation. Obviously, when Josephus is quoting about the events surrounding the time of Antiochus,
Mhm.
the king of the Secluded Empire at that time. He recognized Daniel's prophecy, interpreting that
Mhm.
what God had prophesied all these years in the past is coming to fruition. We see a sort of type of antichrist in Antiochus at that time, and we see the paving of the way of Christianity. So, is there something for us to gain? Yes, of a historical nature, of course. We're seeing the preparation of the time of the coming of Christianity into the world, into the Gentiles. So, from that standpoint, there's obviously a historical understanding that is to be gained. We're able to see the work of God in the Jewish community to take down the Macedonian army. Yeah, there's tremendous history to be gained in God's promise to preserve his people.
Right.
Because obviously, after the Persian Empire, uh, you know, God had prophesied, the coming and the preparation for Christianity. And what these writings do is allow some insight and thought of the Jewish writers on what was happening during these periods. So, tremendous history to be gained, but as a measure of faith and doctrine, no, there is not. So I think that's where we make the distinction. Is it important to understand some of these things? Of course, from a historical standpoint, it does challenge. Here's what these great people had done. Does it inspire them to follow God's law? Yes. But is it a measure for something that we'd be establishing our doctrine on? I say no.
Yeah, so what we would be missing, so to speak, is we might be missing some history, like what you find in the books of Maccabees, but in terms of Christian and actually Jewish Christian doctrine that affect the faith, no, we're not actually missing anything. In fact, I would even argue Second Maccabees, which the Roman Catholic Church uses to support prayers of the dead and even purgatory. I don't think even that passage in Second Maccabees even supports purgatory. And for one, for those Jews that do have it in their canon, later on, they don't actually teach purgatory, at least not in the same way that the Roman Catholic Church does. I mean, so again, another hostile witness there. So James, thank you for that question. Next one, what does Jonathan have to say about the rest of the chapters of the book of Esther, which are found neither in the Hebrew or in the Chaldean? We kind of touched on this earlier. Thank you, 4749er, for the question. But go ahead. The question is directed towards you.
Yeah, these are byproducts, of the Hellenistic period. They obviously did recognize there were things that were so-called missing, or that, and I think what people need to understand about the Greek, tradition, or their writings, and Josephus kind of talks about that when he's making the case for the preservation of the Jewish writing, is the Greeks loved all these stories, and they were trying to pump them up. It didn't matter whether it was true or not. They wanted to entertain their audiences with some sensational data, give it more body to their literature. The attacks Herodotus for, is like, well, as much as the histories wrote, there was obviously an emphasis on pleasing your audience. And when you look at this in the context of, why were additions added to Daniel, why were things added to parts of Esther. Why do we see Baruch? Well, when we look at the genera of Greek literature, they were doing this in all their histories. There was no good story that was good to be passed up in Herodotus' history. So we see the same type of sort of embellishment that is not part of the Hebrew histories. And Josephus makes that point at the very beginning. I'm not going to be adding all this embellishments, all these stories that the Greeks are used to, whether it's true or not true. and I think this explains the context of why they come in during the Hellenistic period, and why
Hmm.
do you see some sensational literature coming in? Why are they trying to bolster Esther? Well, this is in their literary genre. This is what they do with a lot of their Greek literatures to bolster them up. And there's obviously the things that they saw in Esther and Daniel that needed to be a little bit more pleasing to their audiences. The Greeks, they were fascinated by the Jews, uh, uh, overcoming the Macedonian army. Even though they're like, wow, they just beat up on us. They thought it was so impressive, they wanted to put it into their literature. So I think from a context standpoint, we understand why they were doing it. Josephus explains this is part of their historical writings, and all of a sudden, during the Hellenistic period, we see all these embellishments coming on to kind of serve that purpose.
Right. And when you read the additions to Esther and even additions to Daniel, you can tell the genre and how it's written. It reads a lot differently than the Hebrew and Aramaic versions of Esther and Daniel. You can tell that it's being written in a different time period. And do you think that there might have been some influence the additions of Daniel of adding God so abundantly, towards the, in the additions, considering he's not mentioned at all. He's completely absent in the original Hebrew and Aramaic. Do you think there might have been some motivation there?
Yeah, possibly. Well, we can only speculate on that, but you do see the wisdom of the Hellenistic philosophy coming in. We get an ancient legal principle where you separate witnesses in those extra partitions of Daniel, where it's like, okay, well, I'm going to investigate you first to see where collaborating witnesses actually conspire on information. So, uh, it's right in train with the Hellenistic thought, that whole legal mind. And you see that coming out in the literature. And it's interesting. You see the Greek idioms. And that was one of the things that Porphyry of Tyre, was trying to say, well, Daniel is, a byproduct of the Antiochian uh, time period of 167 BC. You have all these Greek idioms, but Jerome, as he pointed out, and he felt he had the support of Eusebius and Apollinarius in Origin on this, is that, unfortunately, he was going to the Greek, not the Hebrew, and the Hebrew is the basis for our understanding of Daniel, and those other parts we don't consider part of Holy Script. And Jerome did feel that Eusebius and the others had his support, and he had the consensus of the church on his side in regarding these literature pieces.
Okay. All right. So thank you for that question. Again, this is from Bible Care and Share Fellowship. Thank you. Question: Do papists, and for people who don't realize, it's a term to describe Roman Catholics. Do Roman Catholics get any doctrines they believe from these extra writings? What we talked about, the belief of purgatory, even though I don't believe purgatory can be supported by Second Maccabees, at least not in the way that the Roman Catholic Church teaches. Otherwise, the later Jews who accepted them would have understood it the same way. But are there any other doctrines or beliefs, that come from these books that you don't find in the Hebrew Bible?
Um, well, obviously, Second Maccabees is the big one, and I think what we saw is that in the Reformation there was an entire industry around indulgences. It was supporting a lot of revenue streams coming into the building of Rome. They had to pay Michelangelo. He wasn't going to do this stuff for free. So there were some economic consequences of not you, you know they needed to justify it. And while I can go into different reasons, I think there was motivation to find justification in the scriptures to support this you know economic fruitful revenue stream into their society, the relics and everything else. So I, I think they understood they needed to have a solid basis for this, and I think Second Maccabees, even though I agree with you, I don't think it supports their view on purgatory. I think we get that more from Aristotle.
Hmm.
His view on the Assyrian lake. I think it's more consistent with Aristotle than it is with Second Maccabees
Right.
on this issue.
Yeah, and I think some of the books teach even about alms giving for salvation or for forgiveness of sins, and in some of the deuterocanonical books.
Yeah,
And
Esther is big on this because obviously the Protestant version it supports our understanding of justification by faith, and I
yes,
think
yeah,
uh, that's the other one in Esther, which is big because it seems like well, what work did she do? She did it, and this is another part of where I can see it would frame, and I wouldn't say it framed their narrative to argue against justification by faith, but the Hebrew version of Esther that has come down is very consistent on the Protestant understanding of justification by faith. You just read Esther and like, yeah. Now, when you add the other part to it, it's that's where I could see it would support the works or infused part of the sort of non justification by faith position. So I would see that would be one where they can argue against the Protestant viewpoint on there. But Esther is another big one too, which we're having. Why do they want it so bad in there?
yeah, yeah. And the one that my friend Jeff from A Goy for Jesus likes to bring up about Tobit is the fish guts. Where the Raphael, who is actually referred to as an angel, he's not referred to as an archangel, just a side point. But he comes to Tobit, and Tobit asks him, well, what is the purpose of what medicinal use is for these fish guts? And he says, well, you gut a fish, you wipe it on your eyes, you blow on it, and it'll cure your cataracts or blindness, however the translation is. And it's also used to scare away demons. And so it's like, I've been in the medical field for 26 years. I've never used fish guts. I've never gone fishing, gutted a fish, and wiped it on my eyes if I'm having problems with my sight. And I've never used it as a medicinal use, in the medical field. And more importantly, it's scaring away demons. That might be like a religious type thing that involves a form of exorcism in a sense to scare away demons, but it's not medicinal. Medicinal involves medicine to cure a physical ailment. So not only is that an error in the book of Tobit, it's a belief, and like I asked Trent during our debate, I go, have you ever used fish guts to cure blindness? So
Yeah.
yeah, and so thank you for that question. And this is also, it says, oh, that's not the one I was actually looking for. Let's see, get rid of that one. Yeah, yeah, this is the one. I am enjoying the discussion, guys. Thank you. Well, praise God, praise Jesus for that. Let's see, next question. This is for both. Which books do you recommend to learn about the canons, whether specific to the old or the new or canon as a whole? No, go ahead.
Yeah, no, obviously, and I need to read your book too. I know I was studying your debate with Trent in preparation for mine, but
Oh, thank you.
yeah, so I went over it 3 times. Obviously, you had a really good command of the issue, but yeah, Steve's book and Trent did recommend this as probably one of the best
Yeah,
books to read on the subject. So I would highly recommend really beginning, there on the question. I think for Trent as a Catholic to highly recommend it. He obviously understood that it did challenge his position, and that Steve has really made some good scholarly gains on this issue from the Protestant side. So I think that'd probably be an excellent beginning to begin this journey.
yeah, and first of all, I want to say thank you for that, Jonathan. I mean, not only for preparing the debate by watching my other debate, but also recommending the book. So, I'm very humbled by that. So thank you for that recommendation, Jonathan. And also Trent, if he's watching this, he's probably not, but if he is, Trent, thank you for recommending the book. That meant a lot to me. So thank you for that. I'm humbled as well. But like it says for for people who are beginners, I try to write it in a way that's the quasi scholarly. I don't consider myself to be a scholar, but I consider myself to someone that takes a situation and a topic seriously. So why Protestant Bibles are smaller, for that one. If you want some real meat, and this isn't an easy book, but I had mentioned this earlier about the Old Testament. I got to make sure it's up right side up this time. But the Old Testament canon of the New Testament Church. This is by Roger Beckwith. It's an older book. It's probably like 40 years old. It's got a lot of meat into it, and he's more than just an apologist, because some Roman Catholic apologists tend to they kind of do the same thing with him that they do with Josephus and Jerome, where they bring him down to a level that he's not. They consider him more to be an apologist. But Roger Beckwith is a scholar at the first rank, at the level of someone like a Lee Martin McDonald. In fact, I would say he would exceed him, because Lee Martin McDonald, he wrote a book called The Biblical Canon, and I read that one as well, and it's good. But ironically, he doesn't tell you what the biblical canon is at the end of the book. And I mentioned this one for the New Testament Canon Revisited by Dr. Michael Kruger. That's actually a really good book as well. So those would be the ones that I would recommend. Let's see. We've got another one here from 4749er. Jonathan, what Anglican apologists and scholars, besides yourself, would you suggest for an Anglican or Protestant for that matter? Well, I personally would recommend Jonathan, but I don't want to speak for him. But so go ahead. Besides yourself, Jonathan, who would you recommend?
Obviously Hooker. I think Hooker. He was involved in a lot of conversations, with the Puritans. There was a lot of good work that was trying to happen to kind of purge, some of the idolatries from the Church of England. I think he took a really good stand on, church government. I thought it was important to establish an anchor to history, but Hooker, I would say, is great. I would also, on the textual issue, definitely John Bergen. One of the great Anglican scholars that I really enjoyed, and really pull a lot of my scholarship and go through his information on. I think those two, if you want to understand Anglicanism and the defense of Anglicanism, even though Richard Hooker is huge, I mean, he wrote so many volumes, but that's really the understanding of Anglicanism. And I think even though there's different communities or traditions within the Anglican communion, the liberal, the broad, the low church, I think he helps define Anglicanism, and I think that's probably as an apologist defending a number of positions. I think that's where I'd probably begin. Um, a lot of times I'm just kind of going over their material and sharing it out, but those I would think would be the best, or Protestant for that matter. I think we have a lot of good scholars. I know Gavin Orland. He does some really good stuff. John, I think it's John Mead. He does some good stuff. There's good scholars out there that are doing some really good work. I mean, Kruger. I got to meet him for the first time last year.
Oh, you did.
Yes,
Awesome.
there was a textual conference with Dr. Elijah Hickson, who invited me out there. I got to meet Peter Gurry for the first time.
Nice.
And they did introduce me to Michael Kruger. Told him I was a big fan of his work. And while I may have some differences with
Yeah.
Kruger, he's an excellent scholar. He does some
Mhm.
really great work. And I kind of thanked him for all the stuff that he's done. So I think he's done some really good work. Dr. Peter Gurry, John Mead over at Phoenix Seminary, I think they have done some good stuff as well. So I think that's probably where, and obviously Steve has done some incredible work. So I think we're just trying to do our best to defend. And I think I do like the honest approach. I recognize myself as an autodidact or self-educated in this particular field.
Yeah.
So I think those are the best. The Christians that want to go in and really defend it from their heart. With no really political interest to gain by it. I think we're some of the best witnesses.
Right. And I'm glad that you had mentioned and kind of alluded to that there's different levels of scholarship that are out there. Like this, I consider myself, as Paul talks about the meat and the milk, I'm definitely milk as far as my books. But some of the ones that you had mentioned, I think William Webster is another one, that I would probably recommend about
Oh,
the canon. Beckwith, yeah, I mean, Beckwith has probably forgotten more than I've learned about the canon. A guy like that, and same with Michael Kruger. But and he also said, Steve, could you write your recommendations in the comments? Yes, after our discussion, I'll put them in the comments where you can find the books or recommendations. I'll go back over our discussion, as well. So definitely can do that. Let's see, we have one more question here, and this is again from 4749er. How does Rome swing around the exclusion of First and Second Esdras, the Prayer Manessa, which belong in the ecumenical apocrypha, but not the Roman Apocrypha? Jonathan.
yeah, and this really comes down to standard. And this is why I did ask Trent, in the conversation, and I believe you went to this very similar line of questioning in your debate too, and I thought it was brilliant. So I wanted to, obviously, so I did take it from you, Steve, and I wanted to expand on it because one of the questions you had brought up in there is talking about the Greek Orthodox, and obviously they're a little more silent on this issue. They're not
Yeah,
as definitive or dogmatic on this issue. They
right.
they try to take a much more silent approach on this question. And one of the points in your conversation I brought up that I thought was brilliant. I'm like, I'm gonna on that on one of the questions is he was like, well, if they ever came back into communion with us, we may go ahead and accept it, which goes to what is their actual standard or criteria? Does this mean if the Ethiopic church comes into communion, are you going to accept the Book of Enoch at that particular time? And I thought it was a brilliant line of questioning. I wanted to sort of press Trent on that to say, while I know he came out in your debates and he was like, "Oh, well, what's the standard?" But by all means, that logic that you say, well, yeah, we may just accept it, but what uh, what criteria is that? Except we're just going to go along. We're not going to create. So there's no really empirical standard by which we accept this, except that we want to be on peaceable terms with the Greek Orthodox since they're coming back in communion with us. So we'll just accept their books. But okay, well, who's right? And it really goes to a question of what's their standard. So, um, my point is there really isn't a standard. I think there's a tradition that was received,
Hmm.
and given the divergence Septuagints that were out there, this is something that had come down. The Western churches were using, and in a period of time after going through all this persecution, they wanted to create some unity. So I think while they weren't in the best position to make that position at their councils based on the information, because they're really going with a non-Jewish source to make this, and they really didn't compare it with the divergent tradition. They went with what had been common in their in their communities to accept. So I say they really don't have no standard, except if they come back into communion, they'll just accept it.
Right.
And I think they try to say maybe there's this evolution or spirit telling us, yeah, now this is
Right.
right.
Right. Yeah. And when I was listening to your debate and I heard you bring that up during the debate, I'm like, hey, that was my argument. That's cool.
Yes.
But later I found out that you got that from my original debate, so it was like awesome. Jonathan is using my argument, and I didn't really feel that Trent's answer to that was really fully satisfying because, and no offense against Trent, but essentially what he was saying is that the books that were at Trent are at the bare minimum the books that are in the canon. You can't reject these books without the anathema being attached to you. If you're a faithful Roman Catholic under the authority of the Pope and the Magisterium, these are the books you must accept. If you reject any of these books, including the Greek editions, Esther and Daniel, you're anathema. You're excommunicated, from the Roman Catholic Church. But then he would say, well, theoretically, if the Eastern Church were to reconcile with Rome, they might be able to bring their books back, and that doesn't mean that the books were missing. It just means that they were preserved in another tradition, referring to Eastern Orthodox or another tradition. But the problem with that is if you actually read the Fourth Council of Trent, and I actually got this from the book, R.C. Sproul's book, Are We Together? It's an excellent book. He actually quotes from the fourth session of the Council of Trent, and he says, the written books received by the apostles from the mouth of Christ himself have come down even unto us, transmitted as it were from hand to hand, all the books of both the Old and the New Testament, seeing that God is the author of both. So he's saying all of the books that Jesus and the apostles passed down hand to hand to the Council of Trent, this is the canon, no more, no less. So the idea of there being books out there in the Eastern Orthodox that might be from antiquity, like Third and Fourth Maccabees or Third Esdras, theoretically, being part of the canon if it was determined by a later ecumenical council or magisterium, this doesn't work because that would contradict the Council of Trent. So Trent Horn's response to this, I don't think really took that into account.
Yeah, I think it's a later ecumenical sort of worldview where we're trying to get back to some sort of status of communion with the Church of England, with these other groups, and here we kind of evolve on our position because I would say in most of their views they've kind of moved away from Trent or their affirmations on a number of issues. So I think it's part of that movement that we see to kind of
Right.
open up dialogue with the other groups.
Right. And the other thing with the question about First and Second Esdras, I give Trent Horn credit for trying to address this because he had mentioned that it can kind of get confusing with the conflation between the different types of Esdras books, and I thought I would actually bring this up here about the councils of Hippo and Trent. They both refer to Ezra as two books, and the question is what is meant by Ezra, and it could refer to Ezra and Nehemiah versus Third Ezra, which was a book written around the 3rd century BC that's not in the Catholic Old Testament, and that would be First Esdras, and then Second Esdras would be the Greek translation of the single book of Ezra and Nehemiah. So is it Ezra and Nehemiah, or is it Third Esdras and Ezra and Nehemiah? And we have to understand what Third Esdras is because Trent partially explained what this was. And I did bring this up during our debate. So, maybe he, when you're in debates, you're going like this, you don't have the relaxation we have, during discussion. You're timed even on Q&As. But what Third Esdras is, and Trent did bring this up, it's most of the book of Ezra. It's half of chapter 9 of the book of Nehemiah, part of Second Chronicles, and because I think it's actually the last 2 chapters of Chronicles, actually, and 2.5 chapters that are not found in Catholic Old Testament. So there's 2.5 chapters. I think it's a guardsman story, I think it's called, and it's 2.5 chapters that are not in Catholic Old Testaments. And I was trying to argue that at Hippo and Carthage, this was the book that is referred to as First Esdras, and Second Esdras was the Greek Ezra and Nehemiah. So Hippo and Carthage would included a work, not just most of Ezra and Nehemiah and Second Chronicles, but also 2.5 chapters that was not affirmed later in Trent and Florence. In fact, Trent voted to pass over in silence. Trent Horn had mentioned about this during the debate, and what that means that they didn't declare it was canonical scripture, but they didn't declare that it wasn't canonical scripture because this is a book that is in Eastern Orthodox Bibles as well. And this is my argument that even if you go by the 4th century councils, which are local councils, by the way, they were not universal, they were not ecumenical. Even if you were to grant that, they included this work that is not identical with later of Florence and Trent. Do you want to add anything to that, Jonathan?
Yeah, and I think to give a little context around the Council of Carthage is they were also arguing for revelation, which the Roman Catholic Church was sort of against with some others. So
Mhm.
part of that statement that we find in there as well is to get the Church of Rome on the same page that we are going to affirm the Book of Revelation, which Pope Boniface had attacked. Not only the Old Testament, but there was a bigger issue involving the New Testament regarding the Book of Revelation and Rome's attacks. Especially Pope Boniface, because they name him particularly in the Council of Carthage under that particular canon. I believe it's 24, 22 or 24. But yeah, and that's where some of this confusion comes in because out in North Africa, out in the Western churches, the Septuagint tradition alone was very divergent, and we
Mhm.
see that
Right.
in and I did bring that up, during the debate in the sense that we do find a lot of differences even within the Septuagint version at what books that they have. So just looking at that tradition alone, and even some of these councils, you don't get to a conclusive answer on these questions. You actually just get more. You get more issues that you have to solve for, and I think this is what happens because when you look at three Ezra or one Ezra's in this particular case, or the Maccabees, they're all over the place when you look at the Septuagint, not to mention Aquila's version or Theodosian's version. And that's why you see the Greek Orthodox taking 10 books, Romans 7, the Council of, Hippo and Carthage. There's divergent traditions because that's what they're making their decision. So they're kind of flawed in their standard because they're relying on secondary and in the at least with the Latin, uh, remove three traditions from the original, and you get all this
Yeah.
extra stuff.
Right, exactly. One of the questions that I know that Trent had brought up to you was about well, if you trust Jerome for the translation of the canon, then did you also trust in his translation of Genesis 3, I think 15, where it translates the that she will crush the serpent's head as opposed to he will trust the serpent's head. And I found that kind of as a non sequitur argument. So you want to touch on that?
Yeah, and part of it is, a translation is a different thing because what you're trying to do is translate, and we see this in translation projects all the time. You're trying to get it over into because there's a lot of Hebrew idioms that, like in the kicking against the prick, you know, we don't understand what that means, but obviously, you got to translate that for your modern audience. And we see Paul, doing this when he's obviously ministering to the Greeks. Now, Jerome has a huge task, and he's looking at a lot of the evidence. He's going to the Hebrew, but yes, it is a non sequitur. Is obviously what I can trust is his methodology. He
Yeah,
said, "Here is the fountainhead I'm going to go to. Here's the manuscript tradition I'm going to base on. Here's my philosophy to come to these conclusions." And while there are things that I would agree in his translation, in his textual apparatus or the Vulgate, where we see differences between that and the Greek tradition, what I do have confidence is in his methodology, and the methodology that he's using is found all across. So it was more of a non sequitur.
yeah,
It's like, okay, so if he makes one bad translation, I know he's on good footing as far as his overall translation project. So, and he had reasons for why he chose the translation that he did based on the documents he had available. But for Jerome to go to the Jewish synagogues and interact with the Jewish community, there's no translation involved. He's like, "Hey, I'm here to translate the book of Tobit or Judith.
right.
We don't have those. There's no interpretation that needs to be made there. he just said they don't have them. It's not
Right.
part of their scriptures. So it's not a question of them banning it or a translation. It's an empirical observation that he made that they don't have those works.
Right.
Uh,
Go ahead.
no, no, go ahead. That's where I was going to end.
Oh, I just want to make sure that you could get finished there, because his argument is that the Latin translation of Genesis 3:15 that Jerome had made is sometimes used by later Catholics in order to support later Marian dogmas. You know that that she had crushed the serpent's head as opposed to he. Now, I would say that he is a better translation. Um, because you find this in Romans 16, I think 16:20, I think it is, where it says the prince will crush the serpent's head. You know, we're referring to Jesus, you know, not Mary, because they're saying they're trying to say that Jerome's translations, you know, refers to Mary. And when this later pope, you know, declared this infallible dogma about Mary later on, he based it on Jerome's mistranslation from the Hebrew into the Greek, but it doesn't follow that just because he translated it wrong and he translated it ipsa instead of ipsum, which the later Vulgate corrected,
Yes.
that means that he's wrong about everything else with the canon. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, and I think that's important, and I think as it relates to Marian, you know, theology on this part is we do know Jerome tried to defend the ever virgin, but what
Mhm.
we don't see in his translation or is in his Vulgate is the word ever. So yeah,
Yeah,
he wasn't trying to infuse his theological principles in there, which goes back to methodology. He does give a lot of good reasons for why he went with the translations that he did. He was familiar with the Chaldean, the Hebrew, the
right.
Greek, so he had a lot at his disposal. But what we see consistent is he held to a strict methodology, an empirical one, as the basis for it. So yeah, it's more of a non sequitur. I think he has a solid foundation. He probably made a lot of bad translations. And Lorenzo Valla, the humanist, the Italian humanist, he attacked Jerome on a number of
Yeah.
these things. So, I mean, uh, so we're not saying he was perfect, but this was a issue that he can easily come to a conclusion on by just looking at their canon and be like, where are these other things that we're used to seeing? So it's not the same thing. It's not to. I hope it's not to attack Jerome's work because he was an excellent scholar. But
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he was definitely the scholar of his time, you know. And the question just kind of puzzled me a little bit because, you know, if you know anything about the Reformation, you know, we don't put our faith in writings of early church fathers, including those who agree with us on the canon. Our faith is on Scripture alone, you know, because people, including early church fathers and even the reformers, can err. You know, Scripture cannot err. You know, and it's like Roman Catholics, including Trent, he doesn't do this. I mean, there's things that he believes about some early church fathers, but the same church fathers, he doesn't agree with things. Like we could turn around and say, okay, you believe in the perpetual virginity of Mary that Jerome embraced, but do you agree with his limited canon? So we could turn around that way,
yes,
or he could bring up about like Rabbi Akiba, where he says that all the books after Sirach do not defile the hands, you know, that they're unclean, as well as the Gospels. So it's like you reject the Deuterocannon, therefore it follows that you should reject the Gospels. And it's like, no, he was rejecting them for two different reasons. He rejected the Deuterocannon because they weren't in the Hebrew Bible. They were not in the Hebrew Bible of Akiba. It wasn't in the Hebrew Bible of the rabbis during his time. It wasn't in the Bible of the Pharisees that the rabbis kind of grew out of, and it wasn't in the Bible of the pre-Christian Jews, you know, either. It wasn't in the Septuagint as far as we know, you know. So but the reason why Akiba rejected the Gospels was because the Gospels were teaching about Christ, that he was a fulfillment of the Hebrew Bible. He was a fulfillment of these Old Testament scriptures. So he considered them not making the hands unclean for two different reasons.
yeah. And I think one of the things that Trent or tried to infuse into the conversation, because he understands he's in a little bit of a historical dilemma, because you have to explain at what point in Jewish history were they part of the Jewish canon,
Right.
and at what point were they banned, or and so he tries to use this statement from Rabbi Akiva. Now, once again, and one of the points I made, there is no pope in Judaism. There never was. They were back.
The closest you could get was a high priest, and even they did not have the same authority as the Roman pontiff does now.
Exactly. So and once again, we see big differences between the Jews of Babylonia and the
Mhm.
ones from Jerusalem. Obviously, two Talmuds. So you know they had differences, but they still hold to the same canon. So um, his thing, and I know kind of David talked about this a little bit, and Gary, there's this fuzzy time that, after the expulsion, I was like, well, what we would expect to see is what we see Paul doing. Paul is doing response to literature. He's writing to all these churches. If there was any real big discussion on, hey, the Christians are starting to use a lot of this literature,
Yeah.
let's expel it from the canon, we would see the same type of response to literature that Paul is doing, sending out to the churches
Right.
among the rabbis, and we do not see that.
I thought
Which,
that was a good argument. That was a strong argument.
yeah, and this is the point that they have to deal with. There's not enough history to support their conclusion that they were ever included in there, except lone references, which can be interpreted in different ways depending if you're reading it from the Babylonian or the Palestinian, on how they interpreted Ben Sira. But where's the conversations about all these other books? Judith, you know, that fits into Jewish culture. There's no Christian response against that except keep kosher, live good lives. That would be in there. So that's what they're missing, is they have no empirical construct to show when it was there and when it left. And this is where Trent is kind of holding on to these statements by Akiva as he's
Yeah.
sort of banning them. No, he didn't say they were banned. He said they could still be used. They're still
Right.
part of the external literature, but that there was a big difference. And
Right.
and there's no one lone rabbi in Judaism. And we would expect, if this was the case, we would look at the Jewish communities and they'd have different canons all over the place.
Exactly. And I thought that was a strong statement, and and it just begs the question: where did Rabbi Akiva get his canon from? I mean, obviously he didn't create it in a vacuum; he had to get it from somewhere, and that he would have been living during the time of the rabbinic Judaism that grew out of the Pharisees, and even Gary Michuta, a Roman Catholic apologist that I debate, stated that the rabbinic Judaism grew out of the Pharisees because there's only two Jewish groups that really survived after the destruction of the temple in AD 70, and it was the Jewish Christians and it was the Pharisees, and they eventually became part. And one thing that I kind of laugh a little bit about, it's almost like they have this dichotomy where the Jewish Christians had the Septuagint, and the rabbinic Jews, had the Masoretic text. Well, first of all, Masoretic text didn't exist back then.
Yeah.
You're talking 200 AD at least.
and,
So,
and they didn't even change anything. All they did was
no,
add the vowel points. They did, and
yeah,
they added some commentary, but they didn't change anything up. So even with the Masoret, they didn't change anything about the canon.
no,
Um, Maybe moved, Daniel to the writings, and they added the vowel points and
right.
some commentary, but they didn't change anything. So we don't see that behavior among the Jewish communities.
Right. And I thought your question was really good when you said, how could the Jews formalize their canon throughout all the Roman Empire in the late second century AD? Do you want to touch on that?
Yeah, and this is the crux of their dilemma, because they do have to explain how this could have been done. Now, Rabbi Solomon, who was a Jewish sage during the Middle Ages, responding against a number of the Muslim polemists, is dealing with the same thing, because the Muslims were saying that, okay, after Ezra, they kind of unified the canon and standardized it and made all these changes. And Rabbi Solomon as well. We got all these communities all over. We would see evidence of this in the different Jewish factions in Yemen and in Babylon, where most of them stayed after the exile. They didn't go back to Jerusalem. That was a small minority group. So, how do we explain that fact? And I think, one of Trent's responses is like, well, they had some rabbis. Well, who are these some rabbis, speaking for all of Judaism?
Right,
And
right,
I mean, you got to explain Yemen, you got to explain Babylon, which the Jews were there until 1948, Egypt. They're all over the world. They're everywhere, and they only come up with this canon. And the only thing he really had in his back pocket is the Ethiopian Jews, a group that we don't even know if they're really even descended from the 12 tribes or back in Exodus. They have really no affiliation, even though the Orthodox Jews took them in. And I think that was much more of a political stance. How does it look to say, no, we're not going to support Ethiopian Jews? I think it would look really bad at that period of history, given everything that was happening.
yeah,
I, I don't think you make that call. So I think there was more of a political climate. Yeah, you have to accept it. Otherwise, the optics are bad on not accepting them. But once again, that's all he had. But he didn't have a historical framework to explain how did they get this new canon unified throughout Judaism.
right. Late question came up here. We've actually addressed this from Giannis's. It's actually more of a statement than a question. He says, they, meaning the Jews, did have different canons. Protestant apologetics have not demonstrated that there was a single agreed upon canon in Judaism. Johnny, what I would recommend for you to do is to go back to the beginning of this discussion, because we're going on the 2-hour, 15-minute mark, so we have to be cutting it short here. I would also recommend for you to check out those books that I'm going to put in the description later. Roger Beckwith's books, The Old Testament Canon of the New Testament Church. If you want something a little lighter, my book, Why Protestant Bibles Are Smaller, and it really shows that they actually they did have a unified canon. And as you had pointed out at the very beginning of your debate, Romans chapter 3, verse 2, when it says the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. And as we established in context, he's talking about the Old Testament scriptures like Habakkuk and the rest of them. And if you notice the terminology, he doesn't say a particular sect of Judaism was entrusted. It says the Jews as a whole, implying that they share this canon. They might have had differences about the resurrection and about angels and other things, but the thing that they were unified on, was about the scriptures. So, Johnny, I would recommend that that you check that out. Now, we're like I said, we're at the 2-hour, 15-minute mark, and there's been some really good questions. And Jonathan, I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to talk about this and review the debate with Trent. Again, I thought you did an excellent job. I really liked your first presentation with the with the slideshow and everything like that. And I recommend people, go to his channel, Jonathan Sheffield on YouTube, and check out his cartoons. I mean, it's like, if anything else, they're entertaining, but they're also very informative and educational. So I would you mind like one more question coming from me?
Yeah. Oh yeah, sure. Go right
Okay.
ahead.
All right. Have you heard about the Abel to Zechariah argument in Matthew chapter 23 and Luke 11?
Yes. So I am familiar, and I believe, and I think there's a case to be made for and against it.
Mhm.
And I think initially, when I was exploring this argument, and even though Trent said he was looking for some stuff, there's some stuff that I had written in the past, and this is one of the arguments that I did use, that Jesus seems to identify the canon with this particular period. When we look at Abel to Zacharias, it goes to the closing of the canon argument, which seems, once again, consistent with Josephus. The Bible is confirming that, and you have two statements in Matthew and Luke that sort of confirms it, because he doesn't refer to
Mhm.
any of these writings afterwards, and he confines the canon to this. Now, There is a Catholic apologist. I think James White debated him. I forget his.
Gary Machuda.
No, not Gary Machuda. There's another one where James White debated him on sola scriptura, and he seemed to be of the position. What is his name? He's a
Mitch
famous.
Pacwa.
Yes,
Father
is
Mitch Pacwa. Great guy, by the way. Smart as a whip. He knows like 12 or 13 languages.
yes, no, incredible scholar. During that debate with James White, he did concede that Jesus in those passages in Matthew and Luke is referring to that particular canon.
There you
Uh,
go.
so Jesus is talking about yes.
Yeah.
So and so I think it's consistent with our argument. I know I've seen other arguments attack the Zechariah
Hmm.
in terms of that. So I think the position is strong on our side, especially for Mitch Pacwa to come out and make that statement. He saw something that seems pretty obvious. If we look at that, it's consistent with Josephus is saying.
Hmm.
It seems to match up with the Jewish histories, even in the Tanaic literature. The spirit has ceased. So I think it's consistent. I think it's a good argument to be made. There is a counter position that they try to spin on Zechariah. I think that's the only thing, but I think it is consistent with our argument. And you had one of the great Catholic apologists concede this point. So
Right, right. Because the reason I brought up, I mean, I love the fact you brought him up because I'm like, yes, yeah, that's the point I wanted to make. Because if you go on my YouTube channel under my playlist, Why Protestant Bibles Are Smaller, I actually called into EWTN. I talked with Father Mitch Pacwa, and I asked him if Jesus was affirming the Pharisaical canon by saying able to Zechariah, and he said yes. He actually affirmed that he was affirming that. And as we know, the Pharisaic canon is similar, if not identical, to the Protestant canon. At least the school of Hillel was, which the Apostle Paul and Gamaliel, were students of. And so I made sure to get that, and my friend Jeff made a more professional copy than I did, but you can go check it out. But if you'll indulge me just for a second here, as you know, Matthew talks about it, Luke talks about it, but there's things that Matthew says that Luke doesn't, and vice versa. And that's the reason why we've got synoptic gospels in order to put them together. So I kind of put the two of them together. If I can, there it goes. Where we combine Matthew 23 with Luke 11. It says, "Upon you," and he's talking to the Pharisees, "upon you the guilt of the blood of all of the prophets shed since the foundation of the earth, from the blood of Abel to Zechariah the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the altar and the house of God." Now, what's interesting, people say, well, obviously this is talking about the Pharisees murdering this Zechariah, but there's no record of this, of the Pharisees murdering any prophets, during that time. They didn't have the death penalty, Rome had it at that time. The other thing is the argument, that Beckwith makes, as well as others have made, is that he's using something called rabbinic name conflation. And what name conflation is calling different people by the same name, by features, characters, activities, or similar actions. And that they're blended together as one. This was done by Z.H. Chaz in his work, The Student's Guide Through the Talmud. And again, Beckwith talks about it. And if you get the book for any other reason, this would be the reason. And he gives examples like Shem and Melchizedek. They're kind of blended together as one. The different wives of Abraham, are sometimes conflated together as one. The prelude to the Psalm, I think 34, I think it is, where King David pretends insanity before the king Ashish, but he calls him Abimelech. And there's a lot of other examples in rabbinic literature, as well as both the Old and the New Testament. But if you look ahead, and again, I'm combining Luke 11 and Matthew 23, he says, "You are witnesses and approve the deeds of your fathers, because it was they who killed them. Fill up then the measure of the guilt of your fathers." So what he's doing is he's conflating the Pharisees, and by saying the penalty is going to be on you, as if you had killed these prophets. In reality, it was your fathers whose tombs you built that actually killed them. So he's not saying that the Pharisees themselves killed the prophets, but rather their forefathers did that they're basically condoning. And if you look at Mark chapter 3, verse 6, it says the Pharisees went out and immediately began conspiring with the Herodians against Jesus as how they might destroy him. So they're essentially guilty by association. I kind of put it this way: if you murder someone and your partner drives the getaway car, even though they didn't do the murdering, they're still going to be found guilty. They might have a lesser sentence, but they're still going to be guilty. They're not going to get off the hook just by saying, "Well, I just drove the getaway car." So I use that one. And another thing too is if you actually look at how this Zechariah was killed, it says, "Whom you murdered between the altar and the house of God." Well, the son of Bechariah, who's sometimes referred to as the son of Edo, it couldn't have been him because he wasn't murdered. In fact, the time period is significant because the son of Bechariah, the Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, happened after the return of the Babylonian captivity. And even though Israel had problems like complacency and disobedience, murdering prophets was not one of their problems. This happened before the Babylonian captivity. And when you compare the method of death that Jesus is talking about between the altar and the house of God, and compare that to 2 Chronicles, it says Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, they conspired against him, and at the command of the king, they stoned him to death in the court of the house of the Lord. Joash murdered his son, and the court of the house of the Lord matches this because it was between the temple or the altar and the house of God. So this is who he's talking about. So what he's essentially doing is that he's conflating one Zechariah, who is a prophet, with his patronym, the son of Berechiah, and the method of death of the other Zechariah, and blending them together and conflating them as if they were the same person. This is what is referred to as name conflation. Now, like as a stick with me here, some people say, well, maybe it's talking chronologically as far as a canon. Well, that doesn't work because the last chronological prophet killed in the Old Testament canon would have been Uriah. He was actually killed chronologically after the son of Jehoiada. So he's not talking chronologically, and he's not talking about chronologically in the history of Judaism, because the last prophet who was murdered was actually John the Baptist. And even though the Pharisees didn't kill them, they had conspired with the Herodians, and it was King Herod who actually had John the Baptist killed. Let's see. Yeah, because like right there, Mark 6:16. But when Herod heard it, he kept saying, "John, whom I beheaded, has risen," when he thought that Jesus was a reincarnation of John the Baptist. So he's actually talking about the last canonical prophet killed was Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, because his name conflation. And remember what was said earlier. You who guilty of all the prophets. So the first prophet that was murdered, it was at the very beginning of the canon, which was Abel at the beginning of Genesis, and the last one would have been at the end of the biblical canon which is in Chronicles. And what's interesting is that you find Chronicles very early on being the last book that's mentioned, like Baba Bathra. What book is mentioned last in Baba Bathra 14b? 2 Chronicles.
Yeah, it's the culmination of the end of the histories that obviously Nehemiah took over from Ezra. So yeah,
Yep.
so it makes perfect sense in the period, and that's the time period of the of the Persian that everything closes up. So
Yep. And things that's interesting is I looked up elsewhere, the New Catholic version of the Bible identifies that this is the Zechariah Jesus is talking about. The New American Bible does. Dr. Christian Brady, who translated the Targum of Lamentations that talks about it, he says it was either an error on the translations part that says the son of Berechiah, but he's also open to the possibility that it was a name conflation. The Gospel of the Nazarenes, which is around 80 the second century, affirms this. Jerome even favored that Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, is who Jesus was talking about. And of course, our good friend Father Mitch Pacwa, is affirming that it's talking about the Pharisees. So when you take all this into account, Jesus is clearly addressing a set canon of the Jews that was around at his time and even before.
Yeah, no, it's good. I'm glad that came up.
Yep. So, like I says, I we're at the 2.5 hour mark right now. Is there anything else that you want to plug? Anything that you got going on? Debates, discussions, writings, anything that you want to share with anybody?
Yeah. I do work with some students that I'm preparing for some actual debates discussion. We do have one coming up. I do have Sayla Cordova that I'm working with. She's going to be defending the Christian worldview. And I know some topics like abortion is going to come up and everything else. In addressing the question, is Christianity the logical worldview for modern society? And she's going to be on Dr. Jennifer Bird, who's out of, I believe, Yale and Harvard and Vanderbilt, who's much more of a liberal or progressive Christian on these topics. Um, that's going to be July 1st. And then I believe sometime in the middle of July, I'm going to be debating Matthew Monger on our miracles or naturalism, but we're going to be exploring what best explains why the Assyrians did not take Jerusalem in 701 BC. So we'll get into a big why Sennacherib could not take Jerusalem. So is as Daniel said or Isaiah says, or is it some a modern? And even though I think the historians are on my side, Herodotus and the Babylonian priest Berossus, or is it some naturalistic explanation why he couldn't do it? So that's going to be coming up in the middle of July.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what, do me a favor, and anything that you want to share, I want to put in the description below, and whatever can't fit, I'll just make it like a separate comment in the comment section so people can find your work, can find you. Again, he's got a channel, same as his name, Jonathan Sheffield. Check it out. It's on YouTube. So send it to me like in a private Facebook message. I'll make sure it gets on there. So, Jonathan, if there's anything else that you want to say or share, I want to thank you again for taking the time. I know you're very busy to come on and discuss this, explaining why it's important because obviously, if whoever the one true church is, at the bare minimum, they're going to have the canon that Jesus passed down to them. And just as a final note, one thing I wrote down a while ago is since the Jews were entrusted with the Old Testament scriptures, if this included the Apocrypha or the so-called Deuterocannon, it would have actually been part of what's called the Proto-Canon or the Hebrew Bible, but it's not. And it's interesting that the books in general that seem to be agreed upon, depending on your tradition, it seems to be those books, but it's the Deuterocanonical books that you see in early history that they might accept some or they might not accept others, but you don't see that consistency like you have with the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah, no, and once again, thanks for having me. I was a huge fan of your debate. I thought you did an excellent job against Trent on that discussion. And I think it's very important, and all the time that I spend out in the secular community defending, this is an issue that comes up. Well, which Bible? Is it 73? Is it 66? Is it 70? And we get these questions all the time,
Right.
and it's one of the inhibitors or one of the reasons why they don't trust the credibility, especially when you have different factions within the Christian community. Some hold 73, 69. There are differences, and it does go to credibility. And given that we're searching for truth, we want to establish it upon good ground. So there's a bigger issue in these discussions and why we have them with Trent Horn.
Yeah, definitely. And again, kudos to Trent for debating both of us. I mean, we might disagree with him on certain things, but he's a stand-up guy. So pray for Trent. And and uh, and again, Jonathan, thank you again for coming on. Stick around after the end broadcast, and so we could talk about some stuff. So.
Oh, definitely. Thanks again for having me on. God bless everyone and yourself, Christy, for all the great work you're doing for Jesus.
And amen. And thanks to everybody in the chat that asked some really good questions and comments. So well, God bless you as well. So bye for now.